One.
Hi, welcome to the In Conversation with Desmond Cole. I'm Maisie Wong. I'm the Vice President of Community Outreach for AKCESS, which is the Arthur Kruger College Educational Student Society. And first, I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land I'm currently on is the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. But if you are on Ottawa, then you are on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And the Mi'kmaq and Algonquin people have lived on this land since time immemorial. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. So I'd like to remind our viewers that during this event that we will be taking questions to Mr. Cole on pigeonhole.at/DesmondCole, and our AKCESS Vice Presidents of Academics, Senna A. Donner and Megan Pinozzo, will be monitoring the questions that you send in. Again, please submit your questions to pigeonhole.at/DesmondCole. And I would like to invite Rebecca, the Vice President of Socials, to introduce Mr. Cole.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Sitar, Vice President of Social Events for AKCESS. And for our third installment of In Conversation With, we have Desmond Cole. Mr. Cole is a freelance journalist and an activist, and also he's the author of the book, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power, which he recently won a Toronto Book Award for. The Skin We're In is an incredible book chronicling systemic injustice within Canadian institutions in the year 2017. Mr. Cole was a former columnist for the Toronto Star, and he is also the author of the article titled, The Skin I'm In, I've Been Interrogated by Police More Than 50 Times. And this article helped spark discussion and action over the practice of carding in the city of Toronto. Mr. Cole is a fierce advocate for Black, Indigenous, incarcerated, and LGBTQ plus communities across Canada, and we are very excited to speak with him tonight. AKCESS and the School of Public Policy and Administration are so glad to have Mr. Cole here with us. And I'd like to start off by thanking you for your time, Mr. Cole. We'd like to start off the event by having you introduce yourself and speak a little bit about the issues that we're currently facing on our campus, along with other policy and policing matters.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you to you. Thank you to Macy. Thank you to all of the students who've been involved in this organizing to allow for this event to be possible this evening. I'm very, very glad to be here with you this evening. And I am feeling a little bit, I prepared some remarks of some things that I wanted to speak about with you before we have some discussion. And I'm going to go a little bit out of order for what I had planned. And the reason I'm telling you this in advance is because I plan to speak about one thing for a large section of my remarks, which I wasn't necessarily going to do. But I started writing notes for it, and I got so convinced that it's something worth addressing this evening that I decided to kind of switch things up. So it is an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I do definitely want to talk a little bit about social policy. And I want to talk about, yes, policing, as you mentioned, Rebecca, and some of the things that are going on our campuses, some of the things that have been going on in the last year and beyond on campuses that I am certainly hearing from thousands, I guess, of different people over the years that I've been interacting with and hearing from and learning from and listening to. I haven't been on a university campus myself in many years, and I never actually graduated from university. University can be a difficult climate and environment, and it can have particular challenges for Black students. And I think I just want to spend a few minutes here at the beginning to address this. I know that there has been conversation at Carleton, not just at Carleton though, but specifically at Carleton recently, about a law and ethics class where a professor, in an introductory kind of fashion, gave an example of the kinds of ethical discussions that could be taking place in his class, and that this professor used as an example of an ethical discussion that could take place in the class, the example of a white professor at the University of Ottawa using the N-word in her class. So first, I would like to represent what I understand in fairness as being this story, because students have been talking about this, and I, I'm grateful to students for even bringing this to my attention. So I want to do justice to this professor's comments before I address them, and I want to make some remarks before I actually address the comments themselves. But first, in the spirit of fairly representing what was said in class, the professor said that this example of a teacher using the N-word in class in Ottawa was an example of the kind of ethical issue that might come up in this law and ethics class. The professor said that the professor in Ottawa had engaged in, these are his words now, engaged in use of language in her course that raised the ire of many students and indeed of the university administration. He went on to say that for some people, there may be good arguments about why this professor would use the N-word in her class, and that for other people, there might be, bad reasons for doing that. But certainly a rigorous debate, we're assuming. And the professor said that some of you, might decide to fall on one or other side of the issue. But the point of the course is to be able to engage in a conversation that gets at different legal and ethical arguments that can be brought to bear on conversations like this. So what I understood this professor to be saying is, I might not always espouse the views that we talk about in this class. I might not be endorsing a certain view that you or others may find odious, but that in order to have a law and ethics class, we need to be able to have a way to talk about those issues and think through them. So that he and his colleague don't mean to offend anybody ever if they have these kinds of conversations, that it's just in the spirit of trying to have those important ethical conversations in class. And, he said if the students feel uncomfortable, that they should let him and his colleague know about it. And that really it's their responsibility as students to do that, because there will be discomfort, right? But that the teacher, the professor doesn't want to do things in a way that's like antagonizing to people. So if we've done something to harm you ever through this course, let us know. And then the professor ended by saying, that a course on ethical judgment means that understanding that other people hold views is important. And, we must be able to raise other people's views as best we can, even if they're not the way that you think, even if they're not the way I think, even if they're contentious, we still need to be able to discuss them. In the spirit of elevating our conversations, like in academic and learning spaces, I would just like to challenge this professor. I would like to challenge his colleagues and his students. I would like to challenge us all right now to reflect on the value of using a racist slur as an example of an ethical discussion to be had in a master's public policy class, right? I'd like to ask why a white person using the N-word, as was the case at Université of Ottawa, why that is so ethically complex and fraught for some people, and why it's seemingly the debate that can never be resolved. And I'd like to discuss actually also what it means for Black students at the public policy school at Carleton or anywhere else. What does it mean for them that school continues to be a place where they have to witness debate, so-called debate, and to see people debating the rights and wrongs of a word that was created to dehumanize us. Forgive me, because I absolutely despise that we even have to have this conversation, and it makes me upset. But I want to engage in a spirit of real learning this evening and of like just honesty. Because I know that people like to blow these things up and say that it's all about taking people down or calling people out. I just want to be real. I just want us to have a real conversation. So the professor at Carleton said that the professor in Ottawa used language in her course that raised the ire of many students and indeed the university's administration. And this is where I would like to begin, because I'm going to ask us to be honest. Is that what happened? Did a white professor use language that just raised the ire of some people? Is that a fair representation, I guess, of what happened? I would say no. I would say that the language that, in the professor's words, raised the ire of some students and some administration was a racist slur that's been being used against Black people for hundreds of years. And I don't know that there's much debate about that, actually. I presume that the professor understands that that word has a certain connotation that is not neutral, because he called it the N-word, right? He didn't repeat the word in his classroom. And by doing that, the professor is making an ethical decision. It happens to be, in this case, an ethical decision that I agree with, because I don't think that white teachers should use that word in their classroom. And I presume by this professor at Carleton not using it, that he agrees that he shouldn't, or other white people shouldn't use it. Maybe I'm reading too much into that, but that's what I see in it. That at least on the surface, we can assume that this professor agrees that he, as a white professor, just like this other white professor, shouldn't be using that language. And so I guess what I'm left with then is, if you understand that this is not up for debate, why would debating another professor who doesn't understand the harm and violence of this language, why would that be some great ethical debate to have in your classroom when you yourself know that you're not going to use it? Or is it just that using the word nigger is a choice that white people get to make, and that some may choose to use it and some not, but that it is not actually a vile slur against us as Black people, and that it doesn't have any kind of, invective or harmful kind of loaded quality to it. I think we all agree. No, we don't all agree on anything. That's not the point, though. The point is that even though we don't all agree on everything, some things don't need to be debated in a master's public policy course about ethics. And I would think that a white person using that word is one of those things. I would think that there's actually like way more interesting and stimulating and important discussions to be had. And so to see that being used as an example, but at the same time being described as kind of like language that raised people's ire, no, like you slurring a Black person is not just inflammatory. It's fighting words, it's dying and killing words, it's hundreds of years of our history words. You don't get to play with this word. You don't get to have your debate. There's lots of things that are worth debating, but again, if you don't freely use the word in your own classroom, why does somebody else choosing to do so? And then, by the way, apologizing and saying also that I don't mean to offend, because no one ever means to offend with this word, ever. They just want to be able to use it in some neutral context that does not exist. And I don't think that that's much of a debate. But I also think that if you're going to use it as an example in your class, there's an issue there, because you're telling your students, as I will continue here, that you see a value in debating things that really I think we should be beyond. So the professor had said that for some, there may be good arguments for this teacher using that language, and for others, maybe not good. Some of you may decide that, the teacher was right, and some of you may decide that the teacher was wrong. And I just want to stop us at that point again and say so what's the purpose of this classroom for public policy students at a university? Is the purpose of it that this is some kind of strange playground where seemingly all ideas are on the table, but what that means is that ideas that we know to be harmful and viciously dangerous to some people are on the table? People hold all kinds of views, right? So I don't think, for example, that a law and ethics class should attempt to have debates on Holocaust denial. It may be important to acknowledge that there are people who deny the Holocaust, but to say that what we need to do is understand and hear the voices of those who deny, and to say that, we do not condone those views, but they must have their fair hearing. That's not necessarily true. They don't need their fair hearing in that classroom, but for anybody who might be subject to harm from those kinds of ideas, they probably don't want to sit there and listen to you decide whether or not this is harmful, or how harmful, or when it should be, part of a fair public conversation or not. You're doing this in an environment, in a school where white people, for the most part, still have all of the power, where white institutions in this country are almost all controlled and led by a very small number of white folks, where the white dominant population of Canada perpetuates, genocide against Indigenous peoples, puts Black people on campus in jail for walking around their own school as a Black person. That's why it's even so hard to even talk about all of this stuff, because it's so ridiculous that we're having this neutral debate while the same systems and forces are crushing down on students, and then they have to go to class and be like, is this N-word used against you fair or not fair? That's going to be a point of discussion. People can debate lots of things. You don't have to debate this, and it's harmful to us when you do, because it's just reinforcing all of the attitudes that say our lives and our value as Black people is up for debate. And if there are some things that you as a professor wouldn't debate, then I would just encourage you to add this to your list. If you don't use that word in your classroom, debating whether or not others should, I would ask you to really just reconsider that. This is how I feel like we get into situations like we've seen with the professor at University of Toronto who didn't want to use people's pronouns. And then we wanted to pretend as though there was some fantastic debate to be had about whether or not respecting trans and gender nonconforming and two-spirit people's pronouns is again, let's go to class and sit there. Who is that really serving? What's the debate about? It hurts people and you don't want to stop. That's what the debate is apparently for, I guess, the white majority in this country. You have the power to hurt us with that word. You could choose not to, but some people who choose to hurt us with that word, or through their carelessness harm us with that word, refuse to take accountability for it or to apologize, and then it becomes a debate. It is not. It's just harmful, and it poisons the environment in the class where students have to sit and listen. But let me go on, because I do want to get into that as well, because the professor said that, the point of the course is to have these kinds of discussions. We don't necessarily hold these views. And if you feel uncomfortable, then it is your responsibility to come and approach the faculty. And again, I just like us to rethink that this evening and challenge that. I would like to rethink the idea that if a Black student is sitting there in class and someone is talking about, in this course, we may be debating whether or not this use of a racial slur against you is okay or not. You're already exercising a kind of unsafety and threat to that person by saying that these are the kind of things that will be up for fair debate in this classroom. Don't do that. Don't do that. And if you need Black people who have experience, actual experience with this language to come and talk to your classes about these kinds of things, I would encourage you to do that. But I wouldn't encourage you to turn it into some kind of both sides debate, which it is not. I can't believe we live in a country where the people who want to have this discussion are so wholly unqualified to do so, both because they are not Black and because they don't listen to Black people. There's plenty of Black people in this country who can tell you and who have told you 1,000 times about why the use of this language is not up for debate and is not neutral, that it harms us, right? As one, I would like to recommend for you all a piece that was written about the University of Ottawa situation by Émilie Nicolas in Le Devoir. I know many of you probably read and speak French. I do a little bit as well. I'm gonna maybe post this for you right now because I don't want to get off my track. But Émilie Nicolas talks about the use of the N-word in this way. She says that it is a weapon, and that basically white people don't want to see it as a weapon, but that it is. And that you can't pick up this weapon without threatening us. And that all we're actually suggesting is that you not pick it up. Because you guys want to pick it up and say, but I'm using this with good intention. I'm not actually trying to hurt anybody. In fact, maybe me picking up this weapon will teach other people about not using it. And all we're saying is, get that shit away from us. We're terrified. And people want to turn that into a debate because the other thing to do other than that, I guess, would just be to listen to Black people. There's lots of things that are worthy of debate. This isn't one of them. Asking your students to be put in a position where they have to listen to you say that and then be like, but if you have a problem with it, come talk to me. I think that there just needs to be a better approach there. There's all kinds of things that teachers wouldn't do, that educators, that professors would not do in a classroom setting for the explicit reason, I would hope, that it would just make the classroom environment more welcoming for their class. And it just comes down to, at the end of it for me, like, think about adding this to your list. And maybe think about learning and doing some homework and researching and thinking about why Black people are so adamant that this not be just another plaything for the debate club. Why it not be, you know, like, as a teacher in the classroom, I want to espouse certain values. Debating the N-word destroys the ability to espouse a certain set of values. I'm not going to do it. Right? Like, maybe instead I'm going to educate myself and I'm going to listen to Black people who are speaking about this stuff and step down from the power that I traditionally enjoy to argue about everything, whether or not, as I said, you live it and experience it every day. And two, again, because we're talking about the academy here, do you like, where are all the citations for the white people using N-word is good school? Like, who are the main scholars in that theory? Where can we see really good kind of, who wrote the best book on why white people should say the N-word? What are we referencing here, guys? What's the other side of the argument? It's not to suggest that we can't have contentious debate in a university setting. Hardly. No one is saying that. We're asking if these kinds of debates about people's gender pronouns and people's racial identity and history, are those things really the key debate questions of our time? And if you feel like that, if these are the easy examples that you draw upon, I just want you to reflect this evening on why that is. But I also want you to hear the voices of Black students on your campus who are saying that we don't want to have to go into school in an environment where debating whether or not this word is right or wrong is a thing that is harmful and dangerous to us. And it just reinforces all of the other kinds of harms that are happening on campuses that we are also, as Black students, fighting against. And so maybe in my last just couple of minutes, then I would like to turn to some of those things, some of those other things. I wanted to talk about objectivity and the view from nowhere. And again, this conversation always gets me a little bit worked up and sidetracked. So I haven't gone there, but let me do say that this notion that we're not coming into somewhere like a university classroom with all of our history, with our racial identity, with our religious identities, that it means something to be Black or Indigenous in the classroom that's different from what it means for other folks. That comes to me from this notion of something that's been critiqued that's called like the view from nowhere. This idea that the neutral space is what we're trying to achieve in a place like a classroom, and that the professor's job is to come in and to like enforce that neutral space by making sure that material from all sides is allowed to enter it. I see this in journalism all the time. The problem is that I've never met an objective or neutral journalist in my life, and I want us to stop trying to pretend that this is an ideal that we should be striving for. Rather, any journalism that doesn't acknowledge the state of what I would call, there's that old saying in journalism about like comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, right? That's like what the service of journalism is really about. Journalism is not a corporate profession. Journalism is not Don Lemon and Peter Mansbridge. Like, journalism is the pursuit of helping people and achieving justice through storytelling. But we just pretend that it's this neutral space where all viewpoints need to be thrown into, and always, white supremacist, settler colonial context, what ends up being the things that must be discussed, or otherwise we can't have a civilized society. Whether women have the right to their own bodies, whether Black people are inherently inherently criminal or deficient, which is what the word nigger means. This is what you guys want to debate. You want to debate whether that word, which means these things about us and is such a deep history, is acceptable. Like, remember where the word comes from. And if you don't know, go and learn. I would rather that professors come into their classroom, and forgive me for the presumption here because I'm not an educator in that way, and I've never been, and I don't espouse to really tell people how to do your jobs, but I would like you, on behalf of what I'm hearing from so many Black people, and from what I also believe, I would just really like you to reconsider some of the approaches here. Less helpful, I think, is that view from nowhere. More helpful is recognizing that you live in a country with a history of genocide, white supremacy, and colonialism, and that like all these things that you guys think are taboos, subjects that need to be debated in the 21st century, are just reinforcing the things that are killing us in the world every day. And they're not debates that are worth having. There are debates that are worth having, and these aren't them. We have to fight that view from nowhere. You can't put the onus on your students to come to class and tell you when your discussion about like whether or not they're human is appropriate or makes them feel okay. And these aren't about the intentions of the professors. I don't mean in any capacity bringing this subject up to impugn the intentions of the person who delivered this in their lecture, because I bet you that a lot of people see nothing wrong with introducing an ethics and law course in that way, that they would use that example too. It's not about your intentions. It's not the point. It's about how what you're doing is impacting your students and what it's doing to the discussion, and how open of a space you're really making it when you say those things, versus doing what I believe you're doing in that instance, is that you're just telling Black students in that case that you won't actually be safe and welcome in a space like this to raise these very issues that I'm raising with you guys tonight. Because the very use of a word to denigrate you is up for debate. And we can't decide. That's not the message that you want to be sending to your Black students. We're living in a time of real performativity where folks like me can be invited to do talks like this, and institutions like universities and colleges can say, we are pointing to this as evidence that we're listening. We are going to have these speakers, we're going to do this spotlight series. And I want to know what's changing on campus. The thing that we've all been talking about since last summer is a man named George Floyd being murdered by the police on camera. That happened in another country, and pretty much every college and university that I know of in this country had something to say about it. But none of them have had anything to say about how police, the way that they approach people like George Floyd, approach people on your campuses, Black people, Indigenous people, people who are presumed to look like they're homeless or drug users. Like, this is happening in our midst in Canada. And while everybody is making solidarity statements and doing performative stuff, they're not addressing the material conditions of Black and Indigenous and other students on campus by reining in and, you know, canceling campus police and campus security and creating, again, systems that provide a safer, you know, campus environment for everybody. It's painful because these things are mirroring each other. We're sitting in classrooms where there's a so-called debate about whether or not it's okay to denigrate us and who should be allowed to denigrate us. And then we step out into campus and the security and the campus police are denigrating us, and people are watching as this is happening. And while the administrators of these schools are making these big professions to understand the meaning of George Floyd, they're not going to do anything about their own campus police and security regimes. So we have to talk about that kind of challenge for us in this moment. Because I hear Black students on campuses talking about the need to, you know, defund campus security and policing and invest in students. I hear about Black students talking about the cost of tuition. And by the way, it really sucks to pay to sit in a place where people debate your humanity. But, you know, a lot of Black students would be assisted by free tuition, by grants instead of loans, and are fighting for these things on their campuses. A lot of students are fighting for the curriculums to not just, as we say, like better reflect, right? Not in some kind of tokenistic way, the experiences of Black people or Indigenous people or others, but literally like tied to the subject matter that I've brought to you this evening. If there's nobody in leadership in a school who can bring the viewpoints that I'm bringing to you this evening to say, does debating the N-word really suit a law and ethics master's course? Like the fact that that kind of influence, whether it be from those who are present now because they listen to Black people and are thinking about these things, or but also the fact that we as Black people are seemingly not in these spaces, that if we get into school, it's harder for us to graduate. That if we graduate, it's harder for us to get the job. That if we get the job, it's a lot harder for us to get tenure. These are all things that students are talking about on the real, like day to day, that are really important things that are structural, that we all, I think, should be paying more attention to. And we can't, because we still have to have debates like the one that I have raised today. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to say, let's have a more fulsome discussion. And again, I just want to salute the students who brought this to my attention, because Black students have been talking about this and shared this kind of information with me. And again, like I know I can't control that as a Black person, that me even speaking in this way will be perceived by some as being just so out of line and disrespectful and so much of an attack. And that's fine, because we live in Canada and this is our lives every day. So my words maybe are not necessarily for those who perceive what I'm saying this evening as being some kind of malicious attack. If you just really want to engage with why we as Black people are so fed up with these kinds of discussions, I hope I've laid out some basic kind of groundwork in my frustration this evening to try and help us think through this better, because no one is more frustrated with having to have this conversation than we are. So I will leave it there and say, let's see what the rest of you have to say this evening, and to thank you once again for this opportunity to be with you. Thank you very much to the students at AKCESS, and just shout out to all of the Black students who are with us this evening, all the Black faculty and staff. You know, it's a lot, and we're gonna keep pushing, and we're gonna keep moving and fighting. And we know that there are people who are listening and fighting alongside of us. So I'll leave it there.
Hi, Mr. Cole. My name is
Please,
Joyce.
please call me Desmond for the rest of this cast, because I can't hear Mr. Cole anymore.
I just want to say I'm a first-year graduate student at Carleton University, and I'm also the diversity and inclusion representative as well. Just before I kind of get started, I just wanted to start off by just thanking you for sharing your truth, just for being with us today and being able to just create the space to talk about these things, because I think it's important to talk about it and to do it in a safe community or in a safe space. So I'm just going to get into the Q&A part of it. So I have it's like a two-part question, I guess you can call it. So just kind of thinking and reflecting, just like what you talked about and just this whole experience. My question to you is, what would you say to all those Black students, the Indigenous students, and the other, people of color students that have had lived experience of racial injustices in schools? What's something that you'd say to them that would, potentially kind of help make the process a lot easier? And then the second part of that question as well is, how do you think other students can be empowered to be able to help with systemic racism on campus, and what steps do you think the universities can do as well to help build a more inclusive and accessible academic environment?
Those are big, very big questions. I learn from Black students. So I don't necessarily have like a specific thing that I want to say that will I certainly don't have any I am so lucky and fortunate to be able to engage with as many students as I do in doing this kind of work, and in sharing my book with the world as I have done in the last year. I've gotten to engage it with a lot of students from different places in the country. People not only invite me to their campuses to talk, like virtually, of course, in this era of COVID, but what is great is that we always have these background discussions about what's going on campus and what's going on in people's communities. And I just really learn from a lot of students who talk about those things and share them with me. And so, I mean, if anything, I would say that fostering those kinds of relationships with one another as students is like one of the most, I think, rewarding and exciting things that can happen, is to have support systems for one another, knowing what you collectively as Black students, as Indigenous students, and having supports, having people around you that you can share this educational experience with. I think we should never be shy to start those kinds of efforts in our schools. We should never be shy to make sure that we have the supports that we need. So I just would say, I encourage students who are doing that work to continue doing it. And I would encourage people who are like, how do I get more involved on campus? Just that, it always just starts with a small group of people, and that sometimes it doesn't even have to extend beyond that, and that small groups of people are often able to start something really powerful and important that speaks to people around them. So don't feel like it has to be necessarily the biggest intervention in your school or running for office. Those things can be great as well, but I just think that there's so many different ways. I learn about what's happening on campuses by just literally engaging in like dozens and hundreds of conversations with people on campus all the time. And there's no more informed group of people. So like you guys have the knowledge and you guys know what your experiences are, and you have the ability to organize and to make the school environment a better place for you as students, and to leave it a better place, hopefully, for the people who are coming in after you. What can schools do? What will schools do? Right? That's actually my question tonight, is what can schools do is not the same as what they will or won't do. So I just gave a really clear example. Our schools are spending millions and millions and millions of dollars to militarize their own campuses. I live in a city that has like distinct sets of campus police depending on what part of the city you're in. These people have their own turf, they have their own weapons, they have their own vehicles. Who are they protecting and serving, and whose experience on campus are they taking away from? Right? Universities and colleges don't want to answer that question in an honest way. They want to talk about George Floyd, as I mentioned. George Floyd was murdered by people who should have never come close to him. And the campus security regimes and the campus policing regimes, as much as this is like, this is abolition 101. What do these campus police and security systems say that they do, and what do they actually do? And why aren't administrations listening to the Black students who tell you what they actually do, and that we cannot live this way? So that's what they should do. Will they? Not without more fight, they won't, because I think that the performativity that I have seen. So there's a young man at Simon Fraser University who was a former student there and who was back on campus, and he was on campus in the cafeteria at Simon Fraser University. And I believe this was the Burnaby, BC campus. And he had security called on him, who started being like, are you a student here? Are you a student here? Now he's a former student. I have to stop right there and question whether or not men with the authority to either harm you or call the people who will harm you are needed on a university campus to walk around asking Black men, do you go here? If that's people's highest notion of safety in 21st century Canada, and that there's no definition of safety on a campus that does not include big thuggish men coming up to Black people and checking our credentials. But the schools can't seem to live without it. I don't know what to tell you. Our struggle continues because they know that this is hurting and killing us. But in their own communities, these same people, don't they support the police being able to roam free on Black and Indigenous people who are walking, driving, sitting, who are unhoused, who are using drugs, who are engaging in sex work? The general society wants the police to go on to those people in the same way that your administrations, unfortunately, want the police to be policing you on campus. So we know what they should do. What they will do is, that's where the fight is for me. And I am fighting along with, look what we just saw this summer. We just saw a resurgence of people demanding a different conception of safety. And I'm seeing the work of people like Robin Maynard, Elle Jones, Idil Abdullahi, just some of my colleague friends. Like, they've been talking about these notions of abolition for a while. Black Lives Matter chapters in our country have been pushing for years around these kinds of reimaginings of our notion of public safety. So anytime these universities want to, we know what they can do. but we have to fight them because they won't, and they don't, and they aren't. And we're dying. We're having our lives ruined. We're becoming traumatized. We're becoming sent to the hospital. We're not finishing our degree. I was stalked on campus at Queen's University by campus police, not campus police, you know, just city police who are always on campus. What the fuck is the difference in the end? These people are all doing the same thing. That was 20 years ago, you know? 2001, I went to Queens in the fall and got followed around all the time in my car on foot by the police. Here I am 20 years later talking about it, and the institutions who can do something about it are all hailing George Floyd's name, but they won't touch their own campus police. And other people like me are getting stalked out there and are afraid to go to the place where they're enrolled to go to school. It's disgraceful. But we're going to keep talking about it because what they can do is different from what they are doing.
That was really good. Thank you for your response there, Desmond. It was really insightful to hear your opinion on our campus issues around Canada. My question is, can you speak to the intersection of race and class, and how are these two interrelated, and why is it harmful to deny this intersection?
I guess what I would say is in the world that we live in, I think that the easiest and most like accurate way to conceive of ourselves is as workers, because that's what the vast majority of us are doing. And, you know, the kind of system that we live under was designed to have somebody at the bottom serving that like cheapest worker function, right? The like lowest labor, the stuff that is the most hard and backbreaking that nobody wants to do and that wouldn't be dignified as so to earn like a decent living. You know, capitalism just really, really likes that there's like an ongoing supply of people to fill that role. And chattel slavery is about that economic imperative, right? It's about making sure that Black people are this labor underclass that can be exploited at all times. And when you are a colonial power and you come to a place like Canada, you want to bring your Black enslaved people here, as they did, but then you also want to control and push out Indigenous peoples who were here before you so you can lay claim to the land. So settler colonialism and the practice of chattel slavery have gotten us to the place where we are today, where, you know, is there a white dominated country on earth where Black people are just doing okay? Is there one? Is there any place in the white so-called Western world that doesn't have like the bad neighborhood where the Black people and the Indigenous people are that you're not supposed to go to? Like this is our condition. It's tied to our history, and it's tied to like, you know, I look at what's happening right now. I look at places like Quebec where we have a pandemic happening and where people are working in the healthcare sector and they don't have status, where there's like hundreds, if not thousands, of Black asylum seekers in Quebec who are risking their lives in a country that will not give them citizenship and won't put them on a pathway towards citizenship. This is a country that said the border was closed, but continues to make sure that Black migrant workers from the Caribbean can come here to grow our food seasonally. They are essential. They must get in and they must do this backbreaking labor with no protections, the kind that other Canadians enjoy in terms of labor. these aren't coincidences. Like Black people were wanted for that role 400 years ago, and we're still wanted to do it now. And I think that the usurping of Indigenous people's land and the destruction of language and the destruction of culture has set Indigenous peoples in this country on a similar, like, low place where structurally the country doesn't want them to be able to have self-autonomy and have control and power. So I think it's very strange sometimes that people try to have conversations where, you know, we need to put race aside and we should talk about class first, you know, because of where the low class positions for some of us come from. It's impossible not to talk about both of those things at the same time. So yeah, I guess I would say that.
So I'm struggling here between questions. I have two that I really want to ask, but I'm gonna stick with one, and it's to do with MLK. So obviously yesterday, our neighbors to the south had Martin Luther King Jr. Day. And nowadays, especially with the protests that took place this summer, MLK is used by certain people to preach about peaceful protesting and nonviolence. And this is used to chastise Black people for the ways in which that they oppose violence. So with all of this in mind, how do you interpret MLK's message, and what is the importance of ensuring that the legacy of Black leaders remains truthful and accurate?
That's a good question. I think because I am not some kind of scholar on the life and you know, public work of MLK. I know some, but again, I would say what I said before, that it is just incredible how many people feel the need to talk about these things. They just don't know anything about what they're talking about and haven't read anything and can't share a Black person who got there 30 years before them and probably taught it to them for the first time that they were ever hearing it. Like, I don't see why we need to do that. It's really annoying, and we don't have to do that every time. But honestly, people are just trolling at this point. I'm seeing Canadian police forces posting about Martin Luther King, but doesn't that really work? Like, wouldn't it make sense in a country where we can't name, you know, DeAndre Campbell murdered by the police last summer in his home in Brampton after he called 911 for help, Regis Korchinski-Paquette falling 20-something floors off of a balcony after the police were called to her home last summer in Toronto. These are Black people who have died in this country. They can't be named by anybody. So of course you're going to talk about Dr. King today, right? Because it's a la mode. It's just fashionable to do that. Now the CIA and the FBI and all of the people who did COINTELPRO, who surveilled Black people for decades, they tweet about Dr. King on a day like today as well. And I would put people like that in the same category as universities and colleges who tweet about George Floyd and make George Floyd statements, but don't want to address all white faculties or all white leadership within universities, don't want to talk about the impact of tuition fees on Black and Indigenous and other students. It's the same performative thing, and it's very transparent. It's not fooling anybody, but it's probably not done to fool so much as it's just done to go through the motions, I think. But I just feel like some of them are trolling at this point, to be completely honest with you. I wanted to say earlier too, in my earlier remarks, that, you know, I'm just so troubled by how often, like, we see these kinds of things. Like, Lynn Bayak is a senator, and I know nobody elected her. Not that elections are some kind of, as we see, they're no arbiter of like who's going to be like a good leader. But Lynn Bayak is a senator who said that, you know, what about the good that's been done in residential schools? What about that? And you're not thinking about that. Would we suggest that Lynn Bayak and her denial of the horrors of residential school system in Canada, would we suggest that that's a good subject for a law and ethics class, and that we should understand the side of people like Lynn Bayak who, for their own racist reasons, would like to characterize genocide as being something else? You know, I offer that as another example just to say, like, why do we have to pretend that good debate means anything is up for debate, means I don't have to bring an ethical responsibility to the class except to bring in all sides. And as long as I'm fairly representing all sides of any discussion, I am doing service to my students. I disagree. I just wanted to get that in because I was thinking about it before. But I went far, far away from that question, Rebecca. Can you help me out?
It had to do with MLK and how everyone preaches about, you know,
No.
peaceful protesting.
I'm sorry. I hope I did address that then, because I went on to something else. But yes, there's a lot of performances going on, and we have to be able to see past them. I think I've made that part clear anyway.
Thank you so much for your thoughts, Desmond. My name is Avi Purohit, and I am a first-year SPPA student as well. So just another question here. When trying to defund the police as a solution to anti-Black racism, what avenues do you see for mobilizing and organizing in such a old white boys club?
So I guess where we want to organize and how is probably like the big question. And first I want to maybe like, I want to talk about public policy for a second, in the same way that I'm talking about like objectivity in journalism and this like view from nowhere that can often be applied in academia. I got into a conversation last year with a TTC official, two TTC officials actually. I often will not show transit inspectors my fare if they ask me for it. I hate transit inspection. Transit inspection is racist, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. It is a racist public policy. And I think we need to talk about it that way, but I had this interesting conversation with these two transit enforcement officers because I got into it with some people downstairs for asking me to show them my fare, and I refused to do it. And then these other kind of, like I said, thuggy guys, the guys who are like, maybe I have the authority to, maybe I have the authority under law to be able to touch you or hold you or detain you or whatever, they come up to me now after I haven't shown the other guys my fare. And I started talking to them, and I said, you guys, by your own numbers, like you keep data on who you stop for transit enforcement in the city of Toronto. And by your own numbers, you disproportionately stop Black and Indigenous people. Like, what a surprise, right? And they replied to me that, you know, we're just out here doing our job and we're not trying to discriminate against anyone. I mean, what else would you say, right? Of course, like, and I believe that the average person believes that about themselves, that they are not intentionally trying to enforce any racial bias, but they're also washing themselves of responsibility for the current conditions, which are, again, to your earlier question about class and race, Socioeconomically, who's the least likely person to afford a fare in Toronto? A Black person or an Indigenous person in this city. Who's the most likely to not be able to pay their rent? Right? Like, this is a story of our country. This is the history of our country, which is playing itself out right now. So from a policy perspective, again, this desire for neutrality tells us that we shouldn't worry about the impact of the policy, that we should worry about what our intention is in introducing it. In the same way that I don't have to worry about the impact of my words on you in the classroom, as long as I'm worrying about my intention when delivering the lecture. No, I'd like to challenge that idea this evening. In the spirit of thinking and in the spirit of trying to be better for ourselves and for one another, I would like to challenge that. If you have a fare inspection regime that targets people based on their ability to pay the fare, in Toronto, you are going to disproportionately be targeting people of color, people who are unhoused, Indigenous people, Black people, because of the demographics, because of the labor circumstances and the devastating economic realities that are racialized in this country. You know, you can look as far back as papers like Canada's Color-Coded Labor Market by Grace Edward Galabuzzi and Sheila Block. I cited that in my book. Income is racialized in Canada. Again, surprise, surprise. So you can't take your neutral policy and say, well, we're just trying to apply the policy and we're not trying to discriminate against anybody. You have to actually look at what the obvious impacts of that policy are going to be and who they are disproportionately going to affect. If our policing regimes in Canada tell us that Black and Indigenous people need to be policed, again, this is Robin Maynard, like the history of slave catching in places like Montreal, the history of slave notices going up on the pole because Black people were enslaved here for hundreds of years. Everyone too, please remember your history or learn it if you don't know. So then the impetus when you see a Black person in 1780s Montreal walking around freely is to be like, that can't be right. We should have a system where some kind of person goes and checks on that person to see if they're really who they say they are. And 230 years later, we have carding, and it's the exact same thing. I mean, the pass law system designed to control Indigenous peoples after the Red River Rebellion in what is now Winnipeg, to say that if you leave your territory as Indigenous people and go where the Crown doesn't want you to go, you will have to present a pass to show that you have the authority to leave. And then the South African government implemented this and created the pass law system in South Africa. They actually took it from Canada. Thank you very much. So when your impetus as a country is to look at Black and Indigenous people like they need to be controlled from a white settler colonial perspective, of course your fare inspectors are going to walk up to me first when they see me on the bus and be like, where's your pass? Where's your fare? Where's your transfer? Of course you're going to do that. But you also know that you're like making a good educated guess in terms of who's unable to pay. So the racism is all like baked right into the thing, right? But we need to be able to have discussions about public policy that recognize these things, that don't just bring the view from nowhere that say policy good, people good, intentions good. Like, we have to be able to actually put these things through the filter of our history and our experiences to say, well, what will likely happen? If you have incredibly harsh suspension policies in school, who do you think, oh my God, let's guess, who do you think the teachers are going to single out to be like, that student is particularly disruptive, that student is a particularly great threat to the ability of other students to be able to learn in this classroom, and so I must take harsh measures to get rid of them? These harsh measures are all pointing at the same people, right? And so like I just wanted to expand on that in terms of talking about like this view from nowhere that we're bringing into a lot of our policy discussions and a lot of our like education and thinking discussions. And again, Avi, I apologize if I've not dealt well with this question. My mind feels a little bit wound up this evening just because of the conversation. I'm apologizing.
Thank you so much for sharing. Very, very insightful for sure. So it looks like we still have a little bit of time for more questions. So this question right here, it's talking about your recent involvement with the protest to defund the police in Hamilton, where it ended up with some arrests being made. So the question is, can you speak a little bit more about the sit-in that you at the Hamilton Police Headquarters and how that has influenced you as a person and your current work on anti-Black racism?
Yeah, I will talk about that. Seriously, Abby, did I even approach answering your question? I'm being serious.
Well, the question was just about defunding the police as a solution to anti-Black racism, but I think you kind of addressed it in a different way where you said that it should be done through policy, and I guess that indirectly would affect how the police would, like the example you gave about TTC, if they were told a different policy, they would kind of attempt it in a different way. So
I believe that our our policy has to be honest about the conditions of racism and white supremacy that exist, and you can't actually make useful policy without taking that into consideration and having it be part of your teaching and thinking and analysis. I feel like what I am learning from abolition thinkers and doers around me is that like the first attention that we need to make is to like support and take care of and amplify the voices of people who are subject to these harmful systems. And so in my city, we made a defund the police motion. 2 councilors brought it forward. And in their preamble, they didn't even mention the names of a single Black person who's been killed by the police here, but they again mentioned George Floyd. And I just don't think that what's necessary or what's going to like shift things is like, we don't need people to have these like big revelations or to try and like really complicate things. Like listen to the voices of people who have been incarcerated, who are still incarcerated right now, who have been removed from the school because of the school resource officer program in their school when they were going to school that like gave them a difficult time. Number of undocumented people in Canada who won't even go to school if there's a cop stationed there. And why would you? But these are exclusions in our society that we're like that we're not paying enough, I think, attention to. So yeah, I give that an example of the fair inspector just because I just feel like it's not doing the thing that we're all pretending and our thinking about what good public policy is has to be coupled with like what is the real actual world that we're living in and what are the problems that we're trying to solve and who should we be listening to in order to get there. The defund movement and the larger abolition movement, I think is like necessarily hitting a lot of walls from the great momentum that happened this summer, because now we have to talk about what it actually looks like on paper. And nobody wants to draw down their police forces. Nobody wants to give money to Black people who can't make rent, just give direct payments to people, you know, like it's going to require more fighting ahead, because what seems obvious to people always reverts to these neutral frames that leave our oppression out of it or assume that we have to prove our oppression before it can become part of the conversation. So but I apologize because I jumped back and forth, and it was Joyce that was asking the next question, wasn't it?
Right, that's correct. I can just go ahead and ask the question again. No problem. So this question particularly is talking about the sit-in that you participated in.
Right, yes.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
it's just more or less just asking, just like your experience, just going through that and how it's influenced you as a person, and your current work on anti-Black racism.
So one of the best organizers in this country that I know is Sarah Jama. And Sarah Jama is facing a fine right now from the city of Hamilton that I believe is in the tens of thousands of dollars that she's in the process of fighting. Sarah and several organizers with a group called Defund Hamilton, they brought attention to the issue of homeless encampments in the city of Hamilton, of which there are more than 20 at this point. And what they were really drawing attention to is that while the city continues to spend all of this money on the Hamilton police force so that it can go into unhoused people's encampments, tent set up under a bridge, tent set up in a public park, the police are spending more and more of their time going into these places, disrupting people who are unhoused, asking them to move, forcing them to move, taking their property, ripping up their tents and using knives. Police use knives to slash people's tents so that they cannot retrieve those items from the garbage and reuse them. So this is what municipal police forces are doing. And again, politicians are talking about George Floyd, but when the police are slashing people's only sense of shelter in your park, you have nothing to say. I went out to Hamilton to support the work that Defund Hamilton folks were doing. And I did a teach-in while I was there. And that turned into us being there for a little while, a few of us sitting inside the Hamilton City Hall, waiting for a response from the mayor of Hamilton, Fred Eisenberger. Fred Eisenberger, after denying this issue of housing was even something worth addressing, and after these demonstrators stayed at City Hall for over a week and were putting tremendous pressure on him, the mayor of Hamilton, Fred Eisenberger, finally said, fine, I'll meet with you. But I only want to meet with a couple of you and only in private. So the group replied by being like, look, we've been camped outside in the cold for over a week and you know where we all are. And there's no private negotiation to be had here. We're advocating in a public way on behalf of people who are sleeping out in public. We're not going to sit in a private room with you. Like, you're a public official, remember? So come talk about what you're going to do with us in public. The mayor didn't want to do that. So instead, the security told everybody sitting down inside City Hall that we were trespassing, and they called the police on us. And the police removed us all one by one, and close to 20 people were given tickets. I actually wasn't even physically handed a ticket. It was just catch and release for me. They just wanted to get all of us physically out of that space. And the whole trespassing or whatever is just the excuse that they used. But it kind of really frames the issue. For the week and a half that demonstrators were outside of Hamilton City Hall, excuse me, I was there a couple of times visiting. I slept over the first night that the camp was established. City Hall was essentially taken over by the Hamilton Police Service. So I want you to imagine a municipal building where there's, a few dozen people camped out along the public square in the front of the building, and probably like 80 to 100 police officers who are just constantly filing in and out of the building, looking at people through the windows of City Hall, patrolling the grounds of City Hall with their weapons and their body armor. What exactly were these people who were sleeping out on the street to bring attention to homeless deaths and disenfranchisement? What were they about to do that needed a military style response there at the City Hall? Spying on people from windows, digital probably imaging, taking pictures of all the people's faces who dare to camp outside to raise an issue of disenfranchisement. They would rather spend their money on those men to patrol us than they would to build affordable housing for people. And they go into the camps and they go down into the ravines and into the parks and they police the hell out of those folks as well. So of course they were going to do it to the demonstrators at City Hall, and we knew that, and we were prepared to face up to the police in order to continue making the point that these resources in a crisis, but at all times, should be devoted to the people who need them. We spend orders of magnitude more policing people than it would cost to just give them supports. But again, white supremacy, history of settler colonial domination of this land, that's why we're here. That's why. That's why, you know, a huge proportion of the folks who have been camping out in Moss Park are Black, and a smaller proportion are Indigenous. You know, encampment support networks like the one in Toronto, and you know, the folks in Hamilton basically ended their demonstration after almost 2 weeks. I believe they did make it to 2 weeks. They ended that demonstration by forming a support network for the unhoused in Hamilton. So we've got a housing support network and an encampment support network in Hamilton now. There's one operating in Toronto. This is a thing that's operating in different cities across the country right now. And these encampment support networks are critical because they're taking care of the basic needs of people by mutual aid. So they're fundraising so that somebody can have a tent, so that somebody can have a sleeping bag, so that people can have water or ice, or be able to have some first aid treatment around them. You know, things that the city should be doing, but has just so failed in doing that people forget that it's their job and think that it's their job to police it now that they've failed to prevent it from happening in the first place, right? And this is in an era where the shelter system is probably one of the most unsafe places that you can imagine to be in a pandemic. So, but then when people sleep outside, we've got the police coming for them there too. COVID is really drawing sharp distinctions at this time about what our society values. And again, on this issue of defunding, I was willing to stand with Sarah Jama and the incredible organizers of like Defund Hamilton, because they're doing the real work and they're exposing the contradictions here and showing what could be done with how much money we have. We have money to police people who speak out about homelessness, but we don't have money to help people get housing, right? And I think that bringing that to the fore is the best way to try and stop it from happening, and to try and mobilize and organize people in larger groups to raise our voices on it. So I was very proud to be a part of that. And my mom was very angry when she saw me getting arrested that night. And I get it, because you know what? I don't want one of these cops who shouldn't be touching me to like give me COVID-19 so that I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you guys today. But we're living in a province where policing people's behavior during a pandemic is the moral and intellectual bankruptcy that you can police your way out of a health crisis, right? So we who know that that's not possible, demanding good public policy is one thing, but you know, if we want to look at the shifts in even conversations throughout public policy, we should look no further than groups like Defund Hamilton, by the group in Hamilton also organized in part by Sarah Jama, who got the police out of the school system there, by the work of BLMTO in Toronto, by groups in Ottawa who were arrested recently for demonstrating for a reduced police budget, just demonstrating to, you know, freeze the police budget, no increase, and people were arrested out in the street in Ottawa recently. This is happening. The work is happening across the country, and we're not going to get great public policy by sitting in rooms talking about it, when like literally I can go and donate to an encampment support network to be like, buy somebody who doesn't have a tent or a sleeping bag. And I can know that the next day a police force is going to be employed to go out and take away the things that have been bought for that person so that they can have a little bit of comfort in the cold. You know, yes, in the boardrooms, sure. Yes, in the classrooms. But if that doesn't get you out into the street, then I don't know what we're fighting for ultimately, because that's an emergency. It's an ongoing emergency.
We have more questions for you, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for tonight. Once again, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and experiences. It has really been a great honor to have you here today. And we truly appreciate all the work you do for our communities. And we've indeed learned a lot. I would also like to take a moment to thank the School of Public Policy and Administration, the Arthur Kruger College of Public Affairs, and the Faculty of Public Affairs for sponsoring this event, and members of AKCESS, specifically Macy, Rebecca, Senna, Megan, Joyce, and Professor Gerald Sabin for helping organize the event. And thank you everyone for joining us today and having these important conversations. This has been a great learning experience.
I just wanted to say thank you again. And I would like to say thank you to AKCESS and to just shout out Black and Indigenous and other racialized folks on campus who continue doing this work and making these conversations possible. I see you. I'm trying to represent the things that I'm hearing from you as best as possible, in the hopes that administrations will actually listen to the voices of students on campus and take action with those students, not go away and take their concerns to be disappeared somewhere, but actually working together with students to make things happen now. So my hope is that we will get somewhere with that, with conversations like these. So thank you, everyone.